Thanks, Alex. I think one of the threads that's come through today is it's great having the technology to collect all the data, but once you've got it, what do you do with it? So it's fantastic that we've got Scott with us, and Scott's going to share with us how to use the data that you collect in a more effective way. And Scott, we had a fantastic comment from Solar earlier on, which I think sort of leads very well into your presentation, which was look for the data, track the data, and allow the data to speak. So I think that kind of sets you up really well for this session this afternoon. So before we start, perhaps I could ask you just to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role at Fragment.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to ConneX for inviting me to be here today. I've been at Fragment now. I head their knowledge group. I've been there for about 2 years. My background is not in immigration, it's not in legal, but rather 20 plus years of creating and running knowledge management functions at large corporations. So my focus has been on building these functions, and of course, in the process of doing so, using big data, helping it with the decision making. And I'm so pleased that it's been such a hot topic today. And I look forward to speaking and answering any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. So would you call yourself a digital nomad?
Indeed, I would, yes.
Good, right. So I know we've got a lot to get through, so let's kick things off. And what I'd like to do is just ask you the question, perhaps you can just demystify the whole kind of thing of big data and bring it down to our level in terms of what actually is big data.
Sure. So when I think of big data, the first thing that comes to mind is the old economist joke. When you have 10 economists in a room, you get 11 opinions. The same holds true, I think, with big data, how people define it. Some people, it's by the definition of big data. Is it, what constitutes big? Is it structured data, like that data that's in databases? Is it unstructured data, like emails? Is it from social media? As one person once explained it, big data is any data set that's really too big to handle through conventional routes. Another way to look at it is just the sheer numbers of it. We can quote, how many YouTube videos are downloaded per minute or per second. The one data point I think that's the most interesting is in 2020, this year, they estimate that 1.7 megabytes of information will be created for every person on Earth every second. With 7.7 million people, that's 13 billion megabytes of information created each second, or put another way, about 150 billion megabytes in the time it took me to explain explain that. So it's huge amounts of information that you are talking about. But really, the way when I think about it, the easiest way to think about it is what you see on the screen here. The 5 dimensions, they call it the 5 V's: volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and value. The volume. Look, I remember a long time ago when I was in college, you had a 20 meg drive. That was all you ever needed. That covered everything. So we went from megabytes, we went to gigabytes, petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes, yottabytes, zenatabytes, something called shalentinobytes, and the next one is something called domigromabytes, which is one with 30 zeros after it. I mean, we're just thinking of big, names for, how to capture this data. So that, there's the volume aspect. There's the velocity aspect. You hear traders now talking about shaving milliseconds off trades. I mean, data moving at e-speed. How fast is a millisecond? The only thing I can think of it in terms of how far light travels. Light travels almost 200 miles in a millisecond. Very quick times. Variety. When I was putting together this presentation, I hit the save button. I had 17 different ways to save the data. And then that, you go into Word, there's 20 different ways. You have audio files, video files, just a whole slew of information, ways to save it, and it has to be understood. You have the veracity. the truthfulness. I mean, we hear a lot about this day, you know, in this day and age of social media and fake news and such, but the data too. When I was in college, you know, you found that one data point, you were happy. Now it's finding the multiple data points and making sense around it. And then finally, the value. What is, you know, determining what is the value of the data, and I'll talk about that a bit later, how to determine that. So that's really the 5 V's. Sometimes you will also hear about 2 extra V's: variation and visualization. The difference between variety and the difference between the two, between variety and the variation, is when I go get my coffee in the morning or my donut, you know, I have different choices. That's variety. Variation is when one day it's a little harder or a little softer, you know, different composition. And, you know, this is important in data. For example, when I say to you, oh, that's great, that's a very positive statement. But if you say something, I say, oh, that's great, well, that's a mild to negative statement. And so it's important to understand, you know, that's variation. It's important to be able to understand that, and the tools out there now are able to pick up sort of these nuances. And then the final piece of it is just simply visualization. You know, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, I say an infographic's worth 1,000 pictures. I mean, the stories that you can tell now with the tools is just amazing. So when I think of big data, I think along those dimensions.
Thank you, Scott. And that was really interesting. And, you know, I think if we can move on now to maybe just talk a little bit more about, you know, what's the big deal with big data? Maybe you can talk us through, you know, your thoughts on that.
I love that. The big deal. So, you know, the dirty little secret of big data is it's useless. It's useless until you do something with it. The analogy I think you hear most often is to oil. You know, back in the 1800s, there was this black sludge in the ground, and it was useless. However, once the black sludge came out of the ground and you were able to move it 200 miles or so or wherever to a refinery, and you actually did something with it, now suddenly you were powering vehicles, you were powering cities. And data is much like that. I mean, big data by itself is useless. It's really, as you can see from this knowledge pyramid, data is at the bottom. It's just stuff. It's how you organize it, how you summarize it, how you synthesize it, you analyze it, you know, to really develop the intelligence, and then from that, you know, from that intelligence, knowledge around it. And so, you know, it's a big data. I'll give some examples, you know, kind of what big data can do. Well, you know, the crowd today is HR professionals, mobility professionals. You know, questions like the efficacy of overseas assignments, for example. You know, a lot of it is anecdotal, but now, you know, you can look at overseas assignments. You can look in a database to see who was where and when. You can match that up with data about how they were performing. You can slice it across gender. You can slice it across time, age, geography, and all sorts of new insights come out of doing that. So, you know, questions that you couldn't previously ask, with big data you can now ask. So you can make, you know, new decision makings possible. Better decision making's possible, because just, you know, simply having more information at your fingertips, it's not anecdotal anymore. You can go back and quote, you know, the data and what it shows. New products and services is another example. So I working for Fragaman in the immigration space, you know, working with mobility professionals, we often hear, boy, it would be great if there was an integrated solution that took into account tax issues, took into account the people issues, obviously the immigration issues, like a Carlson Wagon, the travel piece of it. All of these elements are part of mobility. You know, and previously they were standalone. Now you're able to actually, you know, put those pieces together and make conclusions and put together insights from that. I mean, one of the key things that I'd like to point out about kind of the value of big data, and I'll go through this during the presentation, is by using the big data, I mean, you're moving out of a kind of the what happened mode, and you're now able to answer questions instead of just what, so what now, what if, what next. And those are really the questions that drive decision making in organizations. So you become, by using the big data, regardless of what, if you're HR, your mobility, whatever department you're in, the more you're able to inform the decision making going forward and moving out of the reactive what happened into the proactive will happen, your value goes up. So that to me is the true value of big data.
Thanks, Scott. And I think taking your point about, being proactive, what do you see are the kind of challenges that HR and mobility folks face when they're trying to, come together with, pulling big data together into something meaningful?
It's interesting. I mean, the big data has been around, the term at least has been around for over a decade. And, I spent, before starting at Fragment, I spent a number of years as a consultant on knowledge management. And I would often get the question, am I too late in the game? And my answer is, it's not, are you too late? Are you too early? Because it really needs to use the data, really needs to be done in a thoughtful way. And, as you can see on this slide, one of the key issues is really data discipline. And what I mean by that is, in this day and age, storage is cheap. And a lot of companies, they're just like, well, we'll collect everything. And then we're going to sense make around it. Well, that's not the right approach. I mean, you can see here, I have my phone in my hand. My daughter often uses my phone and she puts apps on it, game apps. Well, what happens when you continue to put game apps on the phone? It slows down and it's difficult to find what you're looking for. Well, the same holds true in organizations. You capture all this information, it becomes difficult to find what you're looking for. The needle in a haystack becomes a needle in two haystacks, a needle in three haystacks. So you really need to be disciplined about what you want to collect. So for example, I used the example earlier. The question is, how do overseas assignments, people on overseas assignments perform better than those who don't go on overseas assignments? Start with that. What is the question you want to ask? What is the data you need to collect that? What databases do you have to, quote unquote, interrogate? We heard earlier, and you referenced it, make the data talk. I mean, put the data to work for you. Find out, think about what the data, where that data can be found. And, our secret sauce is we take our proprietary data, you can overlay public data on it, and the analytics, and that's really how you get to the actionable insights. So you have, there's the data discipline issue there. The second is just simply about knowledge sharing. There's a statistic that says 70% of the data you need is in your organization. Now, I often talk about what's the tacit knowledge, what's on the B drive in people's brains, and how to get it to the C drive, the common drive. Or it might be in the common drive, you might just not have access to it. So it's about, working throughout your organization where data is located. I mean, I as a consultant, I worked with a large relocation company, and the problem was, they have multiple systems, and the systems don't talk to each other. And furthermore, if you're in Asia Pacific, you're not talking with Europe, you're not talking with South America, and there's there's lessons to be learned. There's multiple touch points, and it's about kind of breaking down those barriers. I will tell you one of the simplest things I found, and I advised organizations, when you're holding staff meetings, invite increase the number of people there, invite those that would be of interest. Your value to an organization, too long the theory's been, well, if I tell you what I know, what's my value to the organization? Your value is in your ability to get the right information or pass it along to the right person at the right time, so they in turn can then make the right decision. So there's the importance of knowledge sharing and breaking down those institutional silos. And I can talk more about that in questions and such.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And so, if we sort of take that point a little bit further, what steps can we take to really prepare ourselves to leverage big data in our organizations? How best is it to go around that?
Yeah. So, one thing to understand about big data is big data requires big skills. I mean, it truly is a different skill set. It's not more of the same. It is different. And, oftentimes you'll hear the quote that if you talk to a 5-year-old and think about their first job, I think the statistic is half of them will have jobs that you don't even, aren't even known now. I mean, you go back a decade, data scientist, social sentiment analyst. I've worked with, HR departments, and obviously they look and see what the comments are about the organization and make sure that if there's issues that they put a positive spin on it. You didn't have people doing that a decade ago, trolling the internet, but I mean, it's absolutely critical to maintain your reputation. It's a core retention issue. So many HR departments have the kind of not just putting out the social media, but proactively monitoring the social media. I mean, a little different in this industry, but in the consumer industry, some of them, there's a cable company here in the U.S., they monitor the chats, and if they see something negative within an hour or 90 minutes, whatever the SLA is, they then respond to that person. So they recognize the power of the media, and that's all, they're using big data tools and analytic tools there. But as you can see from this slide, I mean, there's the data side of it, data engineers, and these people are trained. I mean, there are university degrees, data science degrees now. It's not, it used to be for a while, it was just a course on visualization. Now, obviously there's always been a graphic designer, but focus on big data visualization, big data analysis. So, to do it right requires the right skill set. And it's also, you need to think differently. I mentioned earlier, you can raise questions now that you previously couldn't raise, you couldn't ask. I mean, we in working with consultants working as a consultant in the mobility space, one of the things we set up at an organization was what I'll call reflection sessions, where you sort of hit the pause button and said, okay, how are things going? What questions would we love answered that we haven't asked yet? And we debate those, and then we say, wait a minute. And in 75%, we found, we could ask those. The data is out there. Now, the trick is finding it behind firewalls and such, but the data was out there. The classic story I always give is in 2004, there was a small company called Google that was having its IPO. Sergey Brin and Larry Page put out the IPO prospectus. And there was one line in there that said, for Google employees, 20% of their time is spent on something other than their core work. And, management consultants and efficiency consultants raised their hand and said, wait a minute, you're only getting 80% efficiency from people. Well, what they didn't realize, if you look back at Google over the past 15 years, Gmail, AdSense, basically all of their major new products came out of that 20% time. So it's about thinking differently, looking at a problem and beginning to ask questions. I served for a number of years in the military, and I worked doing scenario planning. And when I did that, one of the people I always made sure was at the table was a science fiction writer, because they just had a different perspective. Now, the analogy of that to business is invite someone from one of the other business units or multiple people. They have a different perspective, and ask them as an outsider, how would you look at that problem? What data would you need to solve that problem? So it's about it's about thinking differently, and I put this slide up sort of tongue in cheek, but it's about, what are some of the problems that we see with the big data? If I gave you the number 1, 2 and said, what's the next number in the sequence? Most people would say 3. I said, okay, what if the numbers were 1, 2, 4? People would say the next number in the sequence is 8. The numbers are doubling. I said, okay, what if the number were 1, 2, 4, 7? Well, then the next number in the sequence would be 11. The point to illustrate here is, with all this data, you need to be careful in analyzing it. And that's why kind of the big data analysis should be left to the professionals, so to speak, the people who are trained in this. And, I have on this screen here, I think, one good example of a big data pitfall. As you can see, the per capita consumption of mozzarella cheese and civil engineers doctorate awarded are hand in hand. But that doesn't mean that people who eat mozzarella cheese become much smarter and go off to pursue doctorates in civil engineering. So it's some numbers just correlate well like this, but that's not causation. So a lot of times, when you look at the data, you really need to analyze it, because often you'll get these false positives, seeing things that aren't there, but in some sense missing things that are there. Now, I wanted to put up this slide. This is from Fragment, some of the work we do. And I wanted to pause here and just say, we haven't talked at all about the technology. This particular slide was put together using Tableau, a business intelligence tool. Tableau, in my sense, is no different than a Microsoft Word or an Excel. The cost of entry is maybe, I think last I saw was maybe $800 a year for a license. And within the right skill, the cost of entry, it used to be that the tools for this big data were prohibitive. They were enterprise-wide, tens, $100,000. Now it's, you have desktop power. And it's relatively low level for entry to get the software. Learning Tableau is no more difficult than, in my view, learning how to do a pivot table or VLOOKUPs in Excel. So the cost of entry is relatively low. And this was put together simply by using Tableau. And you probably can't read it, but what it talks to is, this is a dashboard that we set up and looking at immigration cases to help our clients, those that are at risk during COVID-19. And in fact, we found many of our clients, we became the single source of truth for where their people were, because we've been tracking them systematically through, their travels, their filings and such. And so, this gave us insight into, who is at risk. We could look, as you see, there's a map there. We can do it by region. We can slice and dice it over periods of time. That's the graph you see in the middle there. So there's a great deal of value. There's a great deal of information that you can derive from this. And again, if you think about what's the value we're providing, well, we're giving people insight into not only what their logjam is, answering the what, but how to solve it. So, for example, if something was delayed, we could see, well, is this visa being delayed because the government organization processing it is shut down? Or is it being delayed simply because the person is going to country X, and country X no one's going to right now, so therefore it's on hold? And obviously remediation for each of those, there's different ways to approach it, but having that fidelity and that insight, can now help you on a go forward basis, how to address COVID-19 from the immigration standpoint. So in showing this, I wanted to show the power of big data, but also to show you that and let you know that cost of entry into big data is not prohibitively high, and it's falling lower all the time. In fact, there's some open source tools out there that you can use as well.
Thanks, Scott. And do you think there's going to be a much greater interest in big data as a result of COVID? Because, perhaps a number of companies weren't really prepared. They didn't necessarily know where their people were. So do you foresee a sort of greater interest in that going forward?
It's a good question. As I've said to people, and talking about COVID-19 and knowledge management, the first casualty in any crisis is clarity. And so big data helps bring that clarity. There's confusion about, what's next, how do I get my people from point A to point B given these circumstances? We have on our public site, we track that. We provide a lot of, information, for free to the public. So it's about that clarity. And I think people recognize that, when there's a lot of data and a lot of questions to be asked, the natural inclination is, kind of throw up your hands and say, what next? Well, I agree with that statement. COVID-19 is showing the power, of big data at work for helping, whether it's helping solve the crisis or helping companies better understand kind of what their environment's looking like and how it's likely to look. And obviously we play a part in that in our small piece, the immigration piece, but other companies help out with kind of from an operational standpoint, from a more political economic standpoint, the finance side of it. Those are all pieces that play into that.
No, that's great. And, you're a kind of, data expert, a digital nomad. But, for us mere sort of HR and mobility professionals, what are some tips that you could give us, to where do we start on this journey? Because, sometimes it's kind of, the problem is bigger than where to start. So it would be good to get your ideas on that.
Yeah. So, as you said, what to do? Well, the first is, I think, develop a strategy. They say if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Well, pick the roads you want to take. Pick a strategy. Again, the cost of entry is not that high. What questions do you want to answer? Start modestly. And, as I work with people in the industry, it's about scoping out the issues, understanding what data you have access to. It's amazing. People, data.gov, a U.S. site, the U.S. government tries to put all of its data sets on, make them publicly available. UK has a similar. There's plenty of public data out there. For mobility, you can cross-reference it against demographic data that's out there to help drive decisions. It's about what you want to answer, and then working back and finding those data sets. And it's about, finding a budget too. I'll give one example. There was a company we were working for. They wanted to get a better understanding of how useful their benefits were. And obviously they have all the, access to the usage and such. But what they didn't realize was the company providing the benefits had a huge data and analytics group that not only looked at their data, but could provide benchmark data. And, that was sort of a revelation. And it only services them, the benefits group, to make this data available. And they said, you're one of the first to ever ask for it, but we do this all internally, and it helps us make recommendations to you. But they didn't realize that those, the recommendations were coming out of this sort of data. So they said, hey, can you look at this, this, and this? And they said, we'll be happy to. And they crunched through that data and provided them great insights and allowed them, I think, to rationalize their benefit offering and save them $37 million over a 3-year period. So it's about leveraging the resources out there. Again, big data is not little data; it's only bigger. It requires specialists. Now, my Fragment, we have a business and analytics office. Chances are in large corporations, whether it's in the strategy, the finance, or maybe a dedicated office, there's people who do that. They can offer some cycle time to help with. It's kind of the prince on a pauper's budget. You got to see where the resources are and see where you could pull from. But even if you have to do it alone, cost of entry for a decent tool, and again, I use Tableau or Alteryx as an example, is a relatively minor cost. share, share, and share. We talked about, you know, holding those meetings, staff meetings, where you invite others to attend. Another example I always say is, you know, when you respond to someone, chances are if Bob or Susan asks for something, you respond to Bob or Susan. Well, I tend to think about responding to everybody and then working backwards who shouldn't receive this, because it's valuable information, who around the globe, who my counterparts should see this. So it's about, you know, it's about transparency, and I do find that transparency is contagious. So, you know, your ability to do that is helpful. And the last point I would leave you with is create an experimental environment. I won't go so far as to say embrace failure, but we do learn from our failures, and, you know, starting with data and kind of playing with it. We talked earlier about make the data talk to you, you know, bend the data, stretch it a little, see what the data tells you. And then once you find positive results, then you publicize those, and those small wins then lead to bigger wins, maybe additional funding, additional access. So I see we're at the bottom of the hour, but I just wanted to wrap up by saying that's, you know, these are probably the 4 key things I think as next steps that you as a mobility or HR professional can engage in to sort of drive and use and leverage big data.
No, and that's great, Scott. And I am conscious of the time. I'm not sure if we had any questions, but if we didn't, I think we may have to close the session. And I know Sean was just going to say a few words just to close things off.